Hello, my name is Stacey Higginbotham. I am the editor of something called the Internet of Things podcast, and you are here for the Cybersecurity and the Oven panel. So, if you are thinking this is something else, this guy, he's like, wrong place. It's going to be a great panel, but that's cool. All right, I have two of my three panelists, so I'm going to invite them up, and hopefully our third panelist, who happens to be a hacker, so, you know, he's probably off causing trouble, he's going to come on stage. So let's start with Steve Nackers from Sub-Zero. Party Steve. And Gonda, is it Lamberink? From UL. Woo! And he's not going to get an introduction, but he's going to run up on stage. His name is Riley. I actually don't know his last name. Riley Eller, who's from Rubica. So we're going to have a seat and get started. Woo. So first up, how many of you have kitchen appliances that are connected to the internet? Awesome. How many of you are worried about those devices getting hacked or something happening to them? I like how confident y'all are. All right. So why don't we start off by talking about why we should care about the security of our connected appliances in, we'll say kitchen, but I'll extend it to washers, dryers, or whatever else is out there in the appliance world. Steve, you want to get started?
So I think one of the things that's important to understand with your appliances is that, you know, every home has an appliance, and every home that has a connected device, whether it's an appliance or webcam or any other point, each of these is an element that someone can be using or is a part of the security framework of that house. So the cybersecurity and the quality of that device that you have is the overall security of that home network. So it's really the weakest link situation that you have. So making sure that your appliance is a strong link in the chain of cybersecurity within your home is something that you should be concerned about, and it's something that should apply to every device in your home. So literally, whether it's your phone or a webcam or a refrigerator, it is an important consideration that you should be making with your appliances.
Gonda?
Yeah, I would fully agree with what Steve is saying. So basically with Internet of Things and with our consumer products, including our connected appliances in the kitchen, with us adding all of these things to the internet and to networks, we are increasing the attack surface for hackers. And we've already seen consumer products being targeted more over the last few years. It's really the low-hanging fruit for hackers at this point in time, as it's currently quite easy to circumvent security controls that are quite minimal in these products. Yeah, that's how they end up also in large-scale attacks, such as the Mirai botnet attack, for example. And it's becoming a big problem.
All right, so we've talked about things like, oh my gosh, you're going to be able to use some device, appliance, that's poorly secured to access my network and get something useful off my network. Two, there's this idea of your appliances becoming part of a botnet, which is distressing to everybody else on the internet. And I would say three, one of the things I worry about is the devices themselves malfunctioning. So it could be something like, I guess everyone's nightmare is like the oven stays on forever or something like that. That's less rare. And then also this idea of malware, like someone hacking my devices or a set of devices, and I can't chill my ice cream until I pay 45 Bitcoin. That's a lot of Bitcoin for ice cream. I just buy a new fridge at that point. So let's talk about how you guys are assessing these risks. At UL, you guys are setting the standards. So talk about where we are in that process, because it feels like a pretty young process in this field.
Yeah, I would say cybersecurity and how that links to connected products and also kitchen appliances. We've known about cybersecurity for a while, and a few years ago it was more cybersecurity is obscurity. We know the word, but it's more of a buzzword to us at this point, and we don't really know what it means. Over the last few years, and I've been at this for a number of years, I see also manufacturers of products becoming much more knowledgeable and more explicit in terms of what security actually means. And I would say there's emerging industry consensus, at least on baseline security practices or requirements, like having an ability to do software updates or using strong authentication credentials, like strong passwords to connect a device to a network. There's more knowledge and more consensus as well, not maybe to the extent of widely adopted standards, but at least in terms of best practices and guidance, there is a greater understanding and alignment in industry.
All right, so you make appliances. What do you think are the essential elements for a secure appliance today? And then how does that relate to where the standards and regulations are even?
So one of the most important things that you're going to have to consider when you're building a product is in all honesty, your culture within your company. If security is going to be successful, it's going to have to be part of the design process. It's going to have to be part of the culture of the company. It has to be made a priority from start to finish. A lot of times, security is the tack-on that happens at the very end of a product design process, and that is when it is not maintained, it's not gone about on a regular basis, and that's when you're going to see failures and issues with it in the long term. So your company culture and your commitment to that product quality through security is one of the biggest things that's going to indicate your success to it. So then looking at what is out there and what's available for security approaches, things like what UL has done with UL 2900, is what kind of helps establish that guideline and process and helps give you a bit more of a self-audit so that you're not necessarily going to go astray. You as a company may not have a core competency in security, and so hiring the right consultants, following the right guidelines, those things are important to help you establish the right practices. So designing in from the quality, really following it from a cultural standpoint, those are the critical things that are going to make sure that you are able to establish a good quality product that has that security to protect the consumer.
All right, so let's go to basics. Like we mentioned over-the-air updates. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, as a person who is evaluating this, what should I be looking for? So either one, fight it out.
We can just add to each other, but I would say important to update a product. That really means that you take a life cycle management approach to product development and maintenance. So you got to be focused on the product during its entire lifetime, not just when it's made or sold. Then strong authentication to the network to protect the device identity at the network is very important. I would say secure communication, so making sure that the protocols over which the device communicates with the network and exchanges data, it's important that those protocols are secure. Those are a few things I would emphasize.
Yeah, everything that you do with the over-the-air updates is something that you have to really think through. So there's things that you're doing within the control board design itself, even within the micro selection, how you're doing the encryptions and the memory spaces. All those things play into it. But that also includes what you're doing within your own design process, how you're handling and tracking all these types of things, what you've done from an infrastructure standpoint with the type of servers and cloud-based system that you've got in place. There's just all these little elements that have to go into that. And many of the guidelines and standards that are out there, and even things like UL 2900 and then the UL 5500 standard that is out there, they do help give you some guidelines to that. Now, they don't define the design for you, and that's where you as manufacturers and product designers really do have to think about that. But it's also important to really think about what is the life of your product and what is your relationship with the consumer. One of the examples I can kind of illustrate for you is a personal one. So my wife has a 2011 BMW. We got a notice a couple of years ago that the vehicle's cellular connectivity that gives us the map information, et cetera, was essentially obsolete, and that they were rendering it inoperable, essentially bricking that aspect. We're going to provide no further patches or updates. So they said I could bring it in, pay $300 and have it be upgraded to keep those features, or just leave it without those features and they would brick the device remotely, and that would be the end of that feature set. Those features mattered to us, even though obviously the vehicle would continue to drive. We took it in. We're going to pay the money to have it upgraded. The dealer actually recognized the relationship we had with them. They took care of it free of charge, and we were able to continue having those features. So you as a company have to decide, are you going to brick these devices when they hit a point when you are no longer able to meet some of the security and credentialing things that will happen during the next 5, 10, 15 years as technology marches forward? Are you going to put the onus on your customer to pay for these kinds of things? Or are you going to take care of the customer in such a fashion that your business model represents that throughout the entire life of the product, you are going to be responsible for those patches and even hardware replacements that may be required to do that. So you need to think about all those design cycles and how that fits with you and your customer during that period.
At Sub-Zero, how are you thinking about this? This is a luxury brand. This is something like if I spend $10,000 on a fridge and you call me in 7 years and you're like, hey, we're not going to do security updates anymore unless you give us, X $300, I'm going to be kind of upset with you, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. So in our, appliances are designed, for a 20-year life. That's, one of the big things we promise is that quality and value. So from the very start of our design process for IoT, we were focused on how can you deal with 20 years in the IoT space. That's just not an achievable thing with the chipsets and stuff that's out there today. So we made sure that the designs that we used were modular and customizable in a way that we could deal with those kinds of things over time, that we'd be able to swap these things out, deal with what the consumer request would be. So a lot of the low-cost activities that you see people do that make for these smaller chips and things, we avoided those and were able to find more cost-effective means for us that allowed us to be modular and able to address that, because we felt that our customer had that expectation that this product was going to be able to adapt to these things, and we wanted to make sure that was met. Some other appliance manufacturers or device manufacturers may not want to make that commitment. If you don't make that commitment, you need to make sure that that's very clear to your consumer and that they know those expectations, or you're going to have to really reconcile that relationship at that point.
That's true. So I'm hearing things like, hey, maybe more memory in your chips so you can update them over time. Maybe more processing power than you think you need because later you may want to add stuff. Modular designs for your modems and radios. Other like concrete tips that we should think about? That's okay if you don't have any. Those are just some big ones. You don't have to get too nitty gritty.
I mean, the one that you hit on, just the modular aspect is important. The biggest thing we see a lot of is people doing for cost, chip down on their main board. That's the biggest thing I would avoid. Never put it on your main board. And really look at the standards that are put forward. A standard is there to provide knowledge for many, many people and many, many stakeholders, and it provides a lot of insight. So start with the kind of things that UL offers when you start your design process, because it's going to help you make good design decisions going forward.
So from the standard setting side, there are a bunch. There's UL, there is NIST has standards, there are regulatory bodies, like if we think about GDPR, that kind of affects it. There's the California, data. So, yes, there is the Senate bill. So let's talk about how we can reconcile this, what this means for trying to set standards and trying to communicate to the industry what matters.
So I think indeed we've seen over the last few years regulatory demand drivers emerge, so different pieces of regulation that have been proposed and accepted, including privacy regulation, and one may not associate it with IoT devices or products, but also these devices, of course, process privacy-sensitive data, so they are part of privacy protection. And indeed, the state regulation that is going to take effect 1st of Jan in California and a number of other states is focused on connected device security. And it is important for these regulations to be there, but then also to maybe not be too prescriptive, as you don't want to have requirements language in regulation necessarily. That's where the role of industry guidance, documents, and standards comes in. So, for example, NIST is issuing very shortly a set of baseline security capabilities, or they call it baseline security features, in their NIST A259 document, which is currently a draft. That's not a standard, but it's important to take note and apply that guidance that NIST put forward and see how you can incorporate it into your product design. And then there's the role of standards as well. So standards like UL 5500 for remote software updates, and UL 2900, which is a software security standard. Those are indeed important. And then it's important as well to keep looking at what other industry consensus is emerging, which may currently be maybe having the nature of a best practice, not a fully developed standard yet, and start incorporating that best practice knowledge earlier on, because security is always going to be evolving. So as soon as you've codified a requirement, you've got to be thinking about updating it. it's a much more dynamic space than safety is, and risk scenarios are always evolving. So I think the combination of regulation, standards, and best practices and how they can work and enforce each other, reinforce each other is very important.
Sure. I think historically, UL, you guys have been building standards based on physics, right, which are fairly constant, and now you're trying to build standards based on how people might try to attack things. So that's a very different worldview.
And also just the nature of how software is hackable, and our colleague is, our panel participant Riley maybe is probably more versed at speaking at that. But the nature of software and how you have so many potential issues and bugs and weaknesses and vulnerabilities in software really requires you to look much more actively and proactively and in a more agile way at potential new risks emerging. Whereas with safety, also risk scenarios are evolving, but they're not as dynamic.
Got it. And do consumers care about this? Obviously, you're a luxury brand, so I probably don't know that I care. I just expect you to take care of it. But even when I see people on Amazon, the best-selling products in the connected home are always the cheaper products, right? For the most part. And they don't talk about security. Nobody seems to care yet. So where are we in that from getting people to pay for security or even buy based on security?
So we're finally turning the corner, I think, on that aspect of people really caring about it, especially with the recent things with these contractors looking at the voice stuff that Amazon and others were doing, the privacy side of that, with the Target hacks, with some of the other things. People are starting to understand that these do actually have implications for their day-to-day life, that these devices that they're using, that the security actually does matter for it. You are also starting to see situations where retailers like Best Buy will actually start to ask for a mark that indicates that you have achieved at least a base level of security. So there is a marketable level of this. This kind of harkens back in some ways to the early days of Energy Star. There were appliances that were out there that were more energy efficient than others, and consumers had some interest in it. But it wasn't until it was really branded and until it was under that Energy Star label that consumers were able to understand that appliance A was more energy efficient than appliance B. And you're going to start seeing that over the next few years with the security side of things as well, that a device is carrying a base level security certification through X or Y. As you start to see that happen, you will start to see appliances and consumer decisions that will have more choice around that. It's going to take probably a couple more unfortunate events like the Mirai botnet to draw even more to it, but then you will see that cascade happen very quickly. But there are precedents like Energy Star for how to help consumers guide that type of approach.
And there is a federal effort to create an Energy Star for cybersecurity for consumer products. And it's right now just something people are talking about. But do you think that's what we need? Either of you?
I think it's important to bring consumers into the equation. I think to Steve's point, and I think the comparison with Energy Star is very adequate here. Security is not as binary maybe as safety compliance is, like compliant yes or no. Safety is also more complex than that in some cases, but with security there's going to be different levels. Manufacturers are going to be at different levels of maturity for security. And it's important to educate consumers as to what level of security has been built in. It's not going to be one level, or it's not security yes or no, it's security how. And so I think it's important to find ways to communicate that to consumers. And one way is through labels on products that can explain it well. And indeed, the Cyber Shield Act and also other discussions that are happening with industry are trying to provide some guidance. At UL, we've also developed a UL verified mark label specifically for IoT security, indicating what level of security is built into a product.
Because one of the things that we're trying to start educating consumers around, and that the cybersecurity in general has been a struggle, is that people have this impression of the idea that cybersecurity is an A or B thing. That when you buy a product today, it's secure, and therefore tomorrow it's secure. And that's a very dangerous impression for consumers to have. They really need to understand that cybersecurity is something that's maintained through the patches, through the efforts and the cultures of the companies that are building those devices, that literally you can create an incredibly secure device today that due to a vulnerability being discovered, look at what happened with Intel with their processors. For decades, those were considered to be secure physical chips, and researchers found vulnerabilities, Spectre and Meltdown, that now every chip that was manufactured for something in the neighborhood of 15 years is now a vulnerable chip that they're having to patch through. So helping people understand that security is this evolution that has to be an ongoing thing, that a product that's secure today won't necessarily be secure tomorrow, and that that's a relationship that both the consumer and the manufacturer are responsible for, and that some of these marks are representative of the fact that there's a commitment by both parties to maintain that security is an important part of that education that the consumers are going to start going through.
As a consumer, and I'll just speak because I have a lot of connected devices, and I will tell you that it is a pain to patch all of them. And when I start thinking, I get very worried when I hear things like, hey, the consumer has a role too. And I agree. Like, I don't use password as my password, and I change my passwords. But that's about the extent of what I want to do. I do not want to manage, like, if I have to call an appliance person to come and replace a board, that feels like a lot. So I'm curious about the business models that might emerge around something like this, just because I don't want to think about it. I've got a lot to think about. And why am I bringing this connected stuff if it makes my life harder? You're like, that's a hard question.
I was trying to sort out which part was the question.
Sorry. So this idea that the consumer has a big relationship, and I don't know if I want to have that relationship with anyone, I guess is my thought as a normal consumer.
I mean, from our perspective, what we tried to do in this situation was, we established a relationship with the consumer that, we made it clear to them that the security patching and so forth would be taken care of for them, that was something that was going to be addressed and that was part of the agreement that we had for them. If opportunities end up presenting in the products that you have where you do need to do something like a hardware replacement, the key thing there is how do you turn that into being a good experience? How do you turn that into being something like what happened with our BMW, where we came out of the experience with the dealer going, man, they took care of us. I thought I was going to have to go in there for a $300 service thing, and I came back with a nicer thing in my car than I expected. So how do you turn those moments and those relationships into it? That's something that you have to sort out with your business and have planned for. This shouldn't be something that you're reacting to. You need to realize that these things are going to be on your roadmap. They're going to be out in front of you, and deal with that. And that's how you're going to build that. And consumers will get trained to these things over time. I mean, we've already seen that where people recognize now that they have to set a default password. Nobody gets grouchy about having to change passwords on their app when they're setting things up. People are used to that. They recognize that. And frankly, that experience now, if you do that well in the app, is a good experience that actually draws them into the app, helps them start using the app. So how well you do with each of those things is an important step in building a relationship. So again, security, when you do it from the front, can actually be a relationship building part of your brand and part of your process. And so you need to think about it that way, rather than as this thing that we have to do and that we're going to have to force our consumer through. Find a way to make it into an experience that is building that relationship in a positive way. So Stacey's like, security, this is a fun thing for me to do.
Yay! Updates.
And I think we are already used to it in our day-to-day lives, right? Like our apps are updated on our phones, and we are triggered to perform an update if an app is out of date. And I agree. There's always room to make that a more pleasant experience, and I think that's something that manufacturers should be focused on. But that's the mindset that consumers need to start having with their products as well. Like they are not just good to use forever after. No, they require maintenance, and you got to update software, or software has to be updated regularly. And likewise, we are evolving our relationship with manufacturers as it's becoming more of a life cycle and more of a dynamic relationship, that we at an ongoing basis are able to validate the level of security and whether that level is still valid or maybe outdated or needs to be maybe retested or looked into again. So definitely more of a life cycle approach than a product got out of the factory and is sold, and that's the end of the relationship with our consumer.
Okay, just to gauge how interested you guys are in something like this, how many of you guys have actually cleaned your oven? Ever cleaned your oven? Okay, y'all are good. How many of you have actually cleaned your fridge? You're supposed to wipe that sucker down. All right, a lot of you guys are not going to get bacterial-borne infections. I like this. Okay, so you guys might be a good candidate for updating and patching your appliances. Does this give you hope?
It does.
A little? Okay. So we've kind of danced around this idea that security is a process, not an endpoint. And we've kind of talked about all of this. When you're setting up the infrastructure for this, Gonda, on your side, I'd love to hear best practices that you've seen from other companies. And then you've talked about this with, like, it's got to be part of your culture. But what specifically do you have to do to make sure that, this security process is built in, and what are the steps that companies should be taking?
Yeah, I can start. Like, one of the foundational security by design practices is that you have a risk management process. So one of the things that you need to do for the life cycle of the product is have a way to, first of all, learn about new risks. So have intel or knowledge about vulnerabilities, new known vulnerabilities, and have a way to mitigate those. So have a way to classify or categorize those as high risk, medium risk, low risk, and then have a plan of action to address them if they are medium or high risk, for example. So having risk management for security built into your design process is one element, and it starts with the conception of a product, and very early on in the design of the design of the product, not just at the very end when you test a fully developed product.
For us, one of the things that was really key is we were focusing on both the security but also the ease of setup. And so one of the things that we did for that was these lunch and learns, where we were bringing in executives and other team members and stakeholders from outside of our Internet of Things projects. And what we did was we brought them in, showed them these devices, showed them what the setup experience looked like, but we're teaching them about what some of these cybersecurity hacks and so forth look like. So when the Dyn Mirai botnet attack happened, this wasn't something that most people really understood what it was or why it happened and how it could have happened. So having them experience the devices that were actually responsible for that and going through and seeing that made it very tangible how a couple of small decisions in that setup experience was what caused the vulnerability in these devices that allowed for them to be hijacked to create the Mirai botnet. That helped them really understand that us making those small decisions, and it made it very real for them on these simple, cheap devices that we as a manufacturer could not make those decisions. Having that in their hands, having them see how Sonos did something, how a Charbroil device did something, how our device was doing something, that was that start of that cultural change, because we looked at ourselves initially as we're a sheet metal company. We bend it in and we make these ovens. We don't do IoT, and we had to really get ourselves around that. So that hands-on situation with your executives, having them experience and literally sending them home with these devices to try and put them on their home networks, and then having them come to me and complain about how nothing worked, helped them understand that we had to invest to make sure that this stuff worked really, really well. That was what got the buy-in and really started to understand that, well, yeah, if we don't do these little steps that match up to the kind of requests that we get from these standards, we're going to have those same problems, and that's going to really cascade into a bigger and bigger issue for us. So we were able to head that off early on, build up that culture, and then start bringing in people like Riley and other hackers on a regular cadence by working with people like UL to make sure that we were getting secondary checks, looking at NIST. Everything kind of cascades from there once you get that buy-in from those other people. And the only way to get that buy-in is, honestly, send them off to have some bad experiences with some products. That really helps immensely.
All right, torture your executives, think about cybersecurity, and clean your fridges, you guys. Give a hand to our panel. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Stacey.